I met Ning Sikai at my mother's wedding. It was a very stylish wedding by the beach, and the sky was filled with pink Juliet roses at the buffet. It was June, and Weihai had already heated up. I was wearing a pink dress, sitting under a white gazebo, feeling the heat. After taking a sip of soda, I mumbled to myself about why they chose to have an outdoor wedding on such a scorching day. A stranger next to me struck up a conversation, asking if I couldn't stand it either. That was the first time I met Ning Sikai. He looked towards the bride, who was all smiles, and said, "The more mature a woman, the more alluring she becomes." I glanced at him and said, "She's not being alluring, she's showing off." He chimed in, "Exactly, showing off her charm." Haha, not willing to grow old, huh? Later, the bride, with her groom, came over and twirled around in front of me, asking, "How do I look today?" I pointed at Ning Sikai beside me and said, "Mom, he said you're not getting older, you're showing off your charm." The young man's face showed a bit of panic, and he said, "She's your mom? You must have misheard. I was talking about someone wearing a girlish wedding dress being alluring. This lady exudes elegance." My mother laughed and said, "This kid has such a sweet tongue." The groom, whose name was Li Tong, but I preferred to call him Old Tang even though he was my stepfather, said, "He's my friend's son." Then, he scolded Ning Sikai, "What nonsense are you spouting?" This happened in 2014, and I had the privilege of attending my mother's wedding for the second time. Why do I say it's the second time? Because I was still in her womb during her first wedding. Don't think I'm going to tell you a story about Ning Sikai and me. What I want to talk about is my mother's somewhat absurd romantic entanglements. It's been about half of her life, I guess. After meeting Ning Sikai at the wedding, I found out that he was also studying in Hangzhou, just like me. We were the same age and had compatible personalities. We both enjoyed singing, binge-watching TV shows, and at that time, we were both in our final year of university. I regretted not meeting him earlier. Sometimes I think that guys nowadays have evolved pretty well. They can not only be boyfriends but also best friends. Ning Sikai was the son of Old Tang's friend. During our casual conversations, we naturally discussed Old Tang and my mother. Old Tang and my mother met in 2011. He was a somewhat famous playboy, in his 40s, and never married. At that time, my mother had been single for several years. I had just been accepted into college. During the summer vacation before starting college, my mother took me on a cruise for a relaxing getaway. We chose the most leisurely option, eating, drinking, and playing on the ship every day. However, my mother had a natural charm that attracted attention. Whether eating a meal or swimming, there were always men orbiting us. One morning, a man insisted on sitting at our table. My mother elegantly leaned back in her chair and smiled at a man from the neighboring table. The man from the neighboring table turned out to be Old Tang. He understood the situation and stood up, patting the shoulder of the man who joined us. He said, "Brother, why don't you find another place to sit?" The brother promptly stood up and left. Because Old Tang was 1.87 meters tall and had a robust build, he stood up and looked like a lighthouse. My mother said, "Men, they understand the importance of seizing the opportunity." My mother probably understood men better than anyone else in the world. Ning Sikai said, "It seems like your mother can get any man she wants." I said, "You sound a lot like my second aunt." In my second aunt's eyes, my mother was a figure somewhat resembling a fairy. In fact, no need for description, you can already guess that my mother was very beautiful. However, in this world, there are many beautiful women, but women who can use their beauty to their advantage are rare. For example, that day on the cruise ship, I told my mother how fortunate we were that the uncle helped. Otherwise, it would have been quite troublesome with all those men bothering us. My mother was half lying on the bed, smoking a cigarette, and said, "Calling security would have been even more effective than finding men." I asked, "Then why didn't you call security?" My mother looked at me and smiled, saying, "You're still so naive at this age." Yes, now I understand it all. High-end hunters often appear in the form of prey. Most people, regardless of gender, tend to be kind to someone they like. But my mother's logic was different. In her mind, if she liked you, she would give you a chance to be good to her. If she liked you, she would give you a chance to save her. Old Tang worked in real estate and had seen his fair share of beautiful women. But he said, "Your mother's smile is extraordinary. I've remembered it all these years." Frustration, helplessness, powerlessness, a hint of resentment, and maintaining elegance. Old Tang felt a warmth in his heart on the spot, feeling embarrassed not to stand up and do something. From then on, he dived headfirst into my mother's tenderness and never came out. Ning Sikai said, "Do you have a little brother too? That's nice." In Ning Sikai's family, the lineage was sparse. His grandfather was the last in the line. His father had one sister who chose to remain single. Then came Ning Sikai, the last hope. Ning Sikai said, "Your family seems lively, in my family, there's nobody around." However, it's often said that blood is thicker than water, but having more sisters doesn't necessarily mean they all get along. For example, my mother and my second aunt, they had been in a lifelong deadlock. My maternal grandfather had 5 children, 2 sons and 3 daughters, and my mother was the youngest. My second aunt, born in 1969, was 6 years older than my mother. Among the 5 children, she had the best academic performance. She went to university in Beijing and was assigned to work at the municipal committee. She was outstanding in every way. At the end of 1991, my second aunt began dating a boyfriend who often visited our house. At that time, we lived in a bungalow. One day, when my second aunt and her boyfriend came back home, they saw my mother doing the laundry in the yard. My second aunt said, "The sun is setting in the west, you should have washed your clothes yourself." My mother smiled at my second aunt but didn't say anything. Her boyfriend said, "Don't be so mean. Encouragement should be given for doing things." My mother nodded at him, expressing gratitude, but still didn't say anything. My mother was around 17 or 18 at that time, looking very beautiful in the photos. She didn't say a word, but her silence stunned my second aunt's boyfriend. Then, later, it was the end of 1992. My mother had gained a lot of weight. My second aunt used to tease her, saying she hadn't found a husband yet and had turned into a fat pig. But in November, my grandmother discovered that her belly had grown bigger. The family didn't talk about the bloodshed, but it was more or less implied. My second aunt, who was famous for being a righteous person, criticized my mother harshly, and my maternal grandfather, who was conservative and strong-willed, beat my mother mercilessly. However, my mother refused to terminate the pregnancy and didn't reveal who the child's father was. Finally, someone stood up for her, my second aunt's boyfriend. He said, "The child is mine, don't bully her." Yes, my mother's first husband, my biological father, was my second aunt's ex-boyfriend. In today's terms, my second aunt enthusiastically dug up a big scandal, only to find out that she had dug it up on her own head. She broke down on the spot and rushed over, slapping my mother in the face. When my maternal grandfather harshly slapped my mother, she didn't shed a single tear. But when that slap came down, my mother's tears poured down like a waterfall. My father rushed over immediately, hugged my mother, and said, "That's enough. The child in her belly is mine. Beating her is like beating my own flesh and blood." Then he took my mother away. Although it's said that family matters should not be spread, such a gossipy story had already leaked out. My mother's reputation was well known, so there was nothing wrong with telling it. If you're expecting a twist, there isn't one. My mother had intentionally stolen my second aunt's boyfriend. Because of the complicated relationships between these 3 sisters, it was impossible to disentangle their grudges. My maternal grandfather had always worked for the local government but remained honest and not particularly wealthy. They had a decent life. He was the type of person who worked at the district committee but didn't allocate a house for himself, a fact my grandmother criticized him for all her life. My second aunt was a university student and was quite well regarded at her workplace back then. Later, through a leader's introduction, she met my father. My father was from a well-off family, a college graduate with a bright future ahead. This inflated my second aunt's arrogance even more. After finding my father, she started to act as if she were above everyone else. As my eldest aunt put it, every time she came back home, it was like an inspection tour by a county magistrate. She found fault with this and that, and even tested her younger siblings when there was no particular reason. My mother and my eldest aunt couldn't stand her behavior. One day, my mother and my eldest aunt were scolded by my second aunt, who pointed at their noses, saying they were too foolish and that with such poor grades, they wouldn't be able to marry into a good family. My mother said, "Are you studying just to marry into a good family?" My second aunt couldn't hold back anymore. She started to describe my father's family, emphasizing their large house and generous benefits. The sorry fish distributed for the new year was as wide as a palm, and the apples were larger than tea basins. Because she had good grades, she could only consider a family like that. My mother said, "You're wrong, aren't apples bigger than wash basins?" my eldest aunt laughed heartily on the side. My second aunt was grinding her teeth in anger. In the evening, my eldest aunt and my mother discussed it. She hadn't even gotten married yet, and she had already become so arrogant. If she did get married, she would probably make her younger siblings kneel and kowtow to her. My mother snorted and said, "We'll see." Sometimes I think my mother has a natural talent for dealing with men. With old Tang, she gave him an opportunity to be a hero and save her. But with my father, she performed a world where only he understood her pain. It all began with washing clothes in winter. In 1992, my grandparents' home had at least a single tub washing machine. But my mother insisted on waiting for my father and stood in the yard, washing clothes with cold water. At that time, my mother had just turned 18, hadn't been accepted into a university, and worked as a sales clerk in a department store. In my father's eyes, she was the prettiest child in the family but received no special treatment. Especially under the oppression of my second aunt, my mother appeared even more pitiful. My eldest aunt even encouraged my mother, saying that my second aunt was bullying her. My father quietly began to have feelings for my mother. My eldest aunt said, "At that time, your mother and I just wanted to provoke your second aunt. We didn't expect that our play acting would turn into real affection between your parents. If we consider it as stealing a boyfriend, your mother was definitely wrong. However, everything has its cause and effect. If your second aunt hadn't belittled us back then, things wouldn't have turned out this way. To be honest, with your mother's looks and determination back then, your father held her back." My eldest aunt wasn't exaggerating, and my grandmother also mentioned it when she was alive. I attended my mother's wedding for the first time, but I was still in her womb. My second aunt fainted at home. Actually, for my grandparents, marrying an older or younger sister didn't make much difference. My grandmother once said that she and my grandfather weren't particularly satisfied with my second aunt back then because of her assertive personality. On the contrary, my mother, carrying me, endured so much suffering without complaining, making them think this girl was reliable. Truth be told, for families like my grandfather's, academic qualifications were secondary, stability was what mattered most. It was only later that I realized my mother's dramatic performance of suffering wasn't for my father but for my grandparents. She had such a stern demeanor because it suited the family of my grandparents. I once asked my grandmother if she was worried about my mother's cunning nature. She laughed and said, "In these circles, everyone is cunning. Cunning people understand how to weigh the pros and cons and do what's best for themselves. Marrying a naive eldest sister would be worse. She talks about justice but her actions harm others without benefiting herself." Now I understand that the more someone understands human nature, the better they are at negotiating. You do well, I do well, is how everyone benefits. Over the years, my mother's life after marriage was quite good. In 1999, my father quit his job and went into business because my grandfather wanted a grandson, and my mother was so young. I was already 6 years old, and she was only 24. At that time, there were fewer restrictions, so my mother gave birth to my brother in Hong Kong. My brother was born with Hong Kong citizenship, so he stayed there. My grandmother moved there to raise him. My mother flew back to stay with me. Ning Sikai said, "Wow, your mother really loves you." I replied, "My mother once said that all the flesh on her body dropped from her own self. A son belongs to the husband's family, but a daughter is one's own." In 2011, I gained a deeper understanding of this statement. My father and his friends went skiing and had an accident. He didn't make it. My mother, along with me, moved out of my grandparents' large house. However, she couldn't take my brother with her. But we still met during holidays and festivals. My relationship with my brother was fine, but every time he shrugged his shoulders, raised his hands, tilted his head, and said, "So what?" I wanted to punch him. Ning Sikai said, "Your mother is truly smart and has great wisdom." I looked at him, feeling a growing sense of curiosity. Perhaps he didn't realize it himself, but it was quite evident that he paid more attention to my mother than to me. Later, I called old Tang to inquire about Ning Sikai's background. He said, "Oh, so you're still in contact with him? You've actually met his father before, but you might not remember." Let's go back to the time on the cruise ship when old Tang and his old classmates were having a company outing. My mother had her eye on old Tang, this eligible bachelor. But there was another man who secretly had feelings for my mother, and that was Ning Sikai's father. He was already married. How could my mother consider him? He had a few issues. Even though his relationship with his wife had reached its end, he tried to woo my mother by claiming he had found true love. It was quite repulsive. But I heard that eventually, they divorced. Ning Sikai found out that old Tang married my mother and came to see what kind of enchantress she was. However, instead of pursuing my mother romantically, he became friends with me. People are truly strange. There's no difference between Ning Sikai one moment and the next. The only change is that he now had a father. But that instantaneous feeling of being struck by Cupid's arrow disappeared. In the past 2 years, our family hasn't been doing too well. Old Tang had been working in real estate for a long time and wanted to switch careers but got tricked. He was seriously demoralized. During the pandemic, my mother went to Hong Kong to see my brother and almost didn't return. At the beginning of this year, she was diagnosed with breast cancer. She underwent chemotherapy, surgery, and has finally been discharged from the hospital. Old Tang has been really supportive, staying with my mother all along. Many people came to visit her. My brother came, and so did my grandmother. What surprised me the most was that my second aunt also came. My second aunt later left her job and went to a university. She is now a professor. When she was 40, she got married to a colleague. When my mother saw her, her eyes were red. She said, "In the end, you won." My second aunt replied, "I've come to thank you. Back then, I was angry, but your words woke me up. Did I study just to get married? I didn't work hard in academia to become a professor." My second aunt, the righteous scholar, suddenly added, "I didn't do it for the heck of it." It was quite amusing. My second aunt looked at me and said, "How wonderful, having children of both sexes. The first man was a scoundrel, but the second one is quite good." My mother shook her hand, not letting her speak like that in front of me. I understood that now that my father was gone, there was no need to tarnish his image in his children's hearts. But when my father left, I wasn't a child anymore. The woman who accompanied him on that skiing trip didn't need to be identified to know her relationship with him. My mother said to my second aunt, "The man I stole from you, it's karma." My second aunt shook her head and said, "Who can steal something that was never really yours in the first place? Just like knowledge, it's mine, and no one can take it from me." My eldest aunt chuckled and said, "It's been so many years, and you're still the same, talking like a head teacher. We should give you a big red flower." The 3 sisters laughed and cried. They had grown old, finally grown up. That night, I asked my mother if she regretted marrying my father. My mother thought for a moment and said, "Before I married your father, I thought I would have a good life with him." I asked, "So, in reality?" My mother said, "In reality, it was a very enjoyable life." I rolled my eyes. My mother said, "I'm not being pretentious. My life is much better than when I worked as a saleswoman. I have money, a good relationship with my in-laws, and good children. The only thing that's not good is a man. I don't have much to feel sorry for. I truly admire your second aunt, but I can't do what she does. Is her brain something everyone has? If I had been a top 5 student, I would have become a professor too." Both of us laughed. I asked again, "If you had to do it all over again, would you choose the same path?" My mother stopped laughing. She bit her lip and shook her head. She said, Lin, in the era when I grew up, the old folks often said, marry a man, dress well, and eat well. Women used to attach great importance to marrying a good man. Nobody knew that times could change so quickly. I'm not stupid, I took the right path. Now I can live a more comfortable life." The night suddenly became quiet, dimming into a muted glow. Many people saw my mother's glamorous side, living a carefree and joyful life. However, in places where others couldn't see, she silently swallowed the bitter fruits of life. For example, being constantly subjected to insults that were lewd and offensive. My grandfather refused to see her until he passed away, forbidding her from returning to the family home. My father seemed gentle and kind, but it didn't stop him from having affair after affair. My grandmother praised my mother in public for her magnanimity but privately transferred her assets and took my brother away, showing no mercy. Old Tang was a good person and lived a grand life, but now his company is heavily in debt. And now, my mother doesn't dare to look in the mirror. Her once perfect body now bears a large, unsightly scar. She lived well, didn't she? In fact, she had to tell herself that she had lived quite well in this lifetime. She didn't have to think about how times had changed so rapidly. Men were no longer the gods they once were, and women were no longer confined to their roles as the earth. In reality, the 18-year-old version of my mother, full of intelligence and beauty, could have achieved great success on the path of a career. If that were the case, maybe today, those men who shaped her destiny were just appendages in her life. But at 18, she didn't know. She bit her lip, competed with her second sister, and insisted on stealing her boyfriend to suppress her arrogance, leading to a life that didn't truly belong to her. Despite her outward shine, she held a hidden pain in her heart.